Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for sticking with us here or coming in this afternoon to listen to the second presentation that we have as part of Sturgis History Day. And I just want to take a moment to thank all the volunteers that I've been working with. I've only been back home for about a year and a half, a little bit more than that now. And it's been my honor and privilege and a whole lot of fun to be involved with the Sturgis Meade County Historical Society and get involved in activities like producing this and the Scoop of History programs and other things that we do. And I certainly would encourage you or your friends, your neighbors, your family members to join with us as we capture the heritage of our community. The heritage has always been here, it's always been talked about. There have been people who have been good stewards of the heritage of the community. And now finally with the society, there's a collective body that's organized to do it up grand and do it for the really long term. Because that, of course, is important as well. So in combination with what the Fort Meade Museum does, the motorcycle museum that's downtown, the things that go on in Lee Deadwood and in Rapid City, we've got all manner of things historical that are taking place in the Black Hills. And for those of us that are here and interested, I feel it an obligation really to participate and do what I can to make all of this grow. And I'd certainly encourage all of you to join us and share the fun, as the 4-H kids would say. So, it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Wayne Gilbert of Belle Fourche, a Belle Fourche native, law school graduate, a fellow I've gotten to know through some other circles and find him just an interesting character. And we're kind of the same generation and all of that. Married to Christy Thielen, who has roots to Sturgis. Here as well through her mom and dad, their careers in education here and then later on in Rapid City. So the roots of Sturgis go to Belle Fourche and the roots of Belle Fourche come here, and it's all intertwined one way or another. And so that just makes the story so much more rich and interesting. Wayne is going to talk to you folks this afternoon about vigilantes in this region, when sometimes, the sheriff just doesn't have enough manpower and has to, or the citizens they lose confidence in the sheriff to perform, to execute justice or execute people. I don't know where your story's going to go, but nonetheless, Wayne does a lot of historical research and makes a lot of presentations about all things historical here in the Northern Hills. So, I babbled on long enough. Wayne, the floor is yours, and tell these folks about vigilantes.
Thanks, David. He and I are, he didn't want to put it this way, but it's true. He and I are in the old guys breakfast club that meets Saturday mornings in Rapid City, and that's how we got reacquainted. Probably the most interesting thing about vigilante justice in the Black Hills during the period from 1876 to 1895 or so is that there wasn't much. There's a kind of a legend, that circulates about how in Deadwood there was a hanging every day or every week or maybe every month. No. There actually never was a lynching in Deadwood. There were 9, maybe 10 instances of vigilante justice resulting in amateur executions in the Black Hills during that 20 or so year period of time. Deadwood, quite frankly, was not the lawless place that is often legendarily portrayed to have been. It got civilized pretty quickly, quite honestly, and I'll talk about that a little bit too. I do want to say, and we'll talk about it more in detail for you people that are actually Sturgis people, that to its maybe credit or maybe discredit, depending on how you want to look at it, Sturgis had one of the better organized vigilance committees, even though they only had a couple of executions. And Spearfish only had a couple as well, and Spearfish was pretty well organized, but Deadwood actually used the legendary, I'm sorry, Sturgis, not Deadwood, actually used the legendary 3777 insignia. How many have heard of that? That's in vigilante justice in the American West actually got its start in Bannock, Montana in the 1850s. It was rampant. There were dozens and dozens of vigilante executions in Bannock, Montana during that 10 to 15 year period of time. And they began the 3-7-77 insignia that, to the best of my knowledge, was only actually used in Sturgis during the time period that we'll be talking about. 3-7-77, by the way, it's actually on the badges of the Montana Highway Patrol. And it is the toll-free number for Montana Public Safety. It's 1-866-37777. And nobody even knows what it means, but that is what has always been associated with vigilantes in the West. Now, what I've done is kind of assembled a chronological history of vigilante hangings that took place in the Black Hills. The first one is not officially recorded, but it probably happened. Do you all know the book Pioneer Years in the Black Hills by Richard Hughes, published in 1929? Wonderful book. Find yourself a copy of it in your library or wherever you can read it. But anyway, Richard Hughes he worked at the Deadwood paper for a while, the Pioneer, which was established in 1876. And then later on he worked as a journalist at the Rapid City paper. He came to the Black Hills, like a lot of other gold seekers and camp followers, in the late winter and early spring of 1876. Up from Colorado, and actually, you know, it was a kind of a horseback, partly walk, partly just however you get there, up from Colorado. And Hughes came up, and the group that he was traveling with was camped in the Southern Hills in February of 1876. Camped there one night. And as they were camped, a guy, according to Richard Hughes' account, a guy rode in kind of desperate and scared and whatever, and asked if he could sit with them a while. And they said, okay. And then pretty soon, a group, turned out to be a posse, came in asking if there'd been somebody there asking for help, and yes, there was. And the posse that followed this poor fellow in accused him of attempted murder of someone down in Missouri. They had been chasing him for that far, several hundred miles. And he admitted to the crime, but said that he was drunk at the time that he did it, and he really shouldn't be held responsible. And they determined that that was not a good defense, and so they were going to hang him. They did let him write a letter to his mother, according to the Richard Hughes account. They let him write a letter to his mother, and then they hanged him. And they're in the Red Canyon area of the Southern Hills. And according to the Hughes account that is in the Pioneer, or rather his book, Pioneer Years in the Black Hills, there was a headstone. Richard Burnett of Steubenville, Ohio, died February 26, 1876. This account, by the way, was in the very first edition of the Black Hills Pioneer in Deadwood, June 21, 1876. June 24, 1876. By that time, Hughes had made his way to Deadwood, and actually initially Custer. Everything was supposed to happen in Custer, and then all of a sudden it didn't. And so they moved the printing press and everything from Custer to Deadwood and set up the Pioneer, which, as you know, is still in business. As I say, there's no official account of this incident, but Hughes does report it, and did report it in the paper, and it kind of begins a thread of what you often see in contemporary accounts of lynchings in the American West. The people who reported them tried to outdo one another in being rhapsodic in how they, and ironic and humorous in how they reported these, frankly, brutal incidents. What Hughes wrote is, "'Twas a glorious scene on that crisp, frosty morning, and the man who died there that day should have felt proud of his magnificent death change." That comes up now and then, that type, that style of writing about these things. Well, that's the first lynching probably in the Black Hills, and again I say probably because there's no official account of it. But the next one, and a kind of a famous one, is the one that's depicted, well, the scene is depicted here in this first slide that I have, Hangman's Hill in Rapid City, that's Skyline Drive. Sometime about 10 years ago, somebody bought the property and they built a home there, but the tree, or the general area is still there. And this is a picture postcard reenactment of that hanging that occurred in Rapid City in the early years. What happened was, and this was in June of 1877, there were two men, Kid Lewis Kid Curry, and James Hall, who were horse thieves. I mean, they were. And they had made the mistake of stealing horses from a stage company. And they were apprehended. When they were apprehended, there was a young man with them named A.J. Allen. And the three of them were taken into Rapid City. What was then, I mean, it was, Rapid City was not, it was like 14 months old, perhaps, established in February, March of 1876. And they were taken into Rapid City and put in a kind of a warehouse, probably a building owned by John Brennan, one of the founders of Rapid City. And after a few hours, the citizens of Rapid City, probably aroused by the stage company, whose horses had been stolen, broke them out, the three of them, out of this temporary jail and took them up to Hangman's Hill, Skyline Drive, and hanged them. This story is that the young man, Kid Hall, had just happened by bad luck to have fallen in with them, and he had never stolen a horse in his life. He was pretty young, he was a teenager. And the two real horse thieves actually reported this to the lynch mob. They said, okay, this guy didn't steal any horses, we did, this guy didn't. Really, it's true, he's innocent. Unfortunately, the teenager, being a teenager, kind of got mouthy and didn't do himself any good by cursing the lynch mob and all that. So they hanged all three of them. And they hanged all three of them, the legend goes, from the same limb. And what was true then was true of many of the lynchings in the Black Hills, is that they were rather amateurish. Nobody actually was hanged as in terms of having their neck broken, snapped. Instead, they died in other more torturous ways. And these three individuals probably were strangled to death. The next morning when they came up to cut down their bodies, there were scuff marks in the dirt underneath the branch indicating that they had tried to fight. And as a result, Rapid City was known for 2 or 3 decades as Strangletown. Not officially, of course, but it was derisively referred to throughout the Black Hills as Strangletown because they were such amateurs. As is almost always the case, we don't know for sure who hanged these men, but it's quite likely that it was a group of prominent citizens from Rapid City. I guess I can't name names like I can later on when I talk about the Spearfish lynchings, but probably prominent citizens of Rapid City. Nobody ever did find out who did it, but there were, for probably 50 years following the incident, there were a lot of speculations about it. And John McClintock, who wrote the book Pioneer Days in the Black Hills, published about the same time as the Hughes book. Anybody know the McClintock book? Another pretty good book. McClintock, when he published his book and he wrote about it, he said, he knew who had done the lynchings because he knew a young man who had actually witnessed the lynchings, a young man named Jenick, who later on worked for McClintock. And that, according to McClintock, one of these days, Jenick was going to tell all and was going to reveal the names of the people who lynched these men, the Vigilantes. Well, that never happened. There was a guy who was wandering around in Rapid City in the 19-teens who claimed to know who had done it. And that fellow was caused so much trouble that a group of prominent citizens in Rapid City began proceedings to have him declared insane, and they did. He was declared insane by the courts at the time and shipped off to the asylum in Yankton, where he died. And so, as a result, we don't know who did that, and we don't have a clue who. They would have grand juries and they would have coroner's inquests, and it'd always say death by undetermined circumstances, and that's what happened with respect to that. It was reported rather matter-of-factly by the Deadwood papers. The headline was, 3 horse thieves captured and hung to a tree. But within very few months, sympathetic stories started coming out about the poor young man who was not guilty, and about the incompetence of the people who did the hanging, but still don't know. Now, the Black Hills went for, almost 15 months before there was another lynching, but and that occurred in Spearfish. And the interesting thing about this lynching is it was kind of confessed to before it actually happened. Spearfish had a prominent businessman named John Cashner, Uncle John Cashner. He had a store on the corner of Hudson and, I can't remember the name of the street, but It's not far from the Steerfish restaurant, if you know where that is. That's where Uncle John's store was. Well, this Uncle John went into the offices of the Deadwood newspaper in July of 1878, and he said, there's a group of us in Spearfish who are tired of all this horse thievery and cattle rustling, and we've formed a vigilance committee. And we've actually already dispatched one horse thief. There's no record of that particular horse thief. But anyway, this Uncle John came in and told the Spearfish paper that there was a vigilance committee and he was part of it. And they were going to make sure that people who stole horses and cattle were brought to justice. This, by the way, this is Uncle John, as he was a Civil War veteran before he went to Spearfish. And that's a photograph of him at about the time of the Civil War in the 1860s. And then, of course, this one is later on. Cashner was never accused of any crime. He lived in Spearfish until 1905 or thereabouts, and then was advised by a doctor that he needed to get to a different climate. He moved to Seattle, where he spent the rest of his days. Some of you may have heard of him because he is the guy who was really responsible, at least from a commercial standpoint, of promoting the Thone Stone in Spearfish. John Cashner displayed the Thone Stone in the storefront of one of his stores. He had liquor stores, drug stores, ran a photography shop, a general store, and he actually displayed the Thone Stone and worked hard to promote it. The Spearfish city father. Now, roughly 2 months after Cashner went in and boasted to the Deadwood paper about the fact that they had a vigilance committee, there were a couple of cattle rustlers, or alleged cattle rustlers, that were apprehended near the foot of Lookout Mountain, pretty much along the back nine of where the Spearfish Country Club is now. Early in the morning, they had apparently spent the night there, sleeping in their saddle blankets, as cowboys were wont to do, according to the movies. And they had a sort of a mini trial, maybe, and they were hanged. And these two fellows were named Orbeen Davis and George Keating. This is Orbeen Davis. He was a young man. He had a ranch in the immediate area of Lookout Mountain. I don't have a photograph of George Keating, never did find one. But George Keating was a butcher in Central City, had a butcher shop. So the story is that Keating was supplementing his inventory with cattle rustling, and the ranchers in the area, the who's who, and the Uncle John Cashners, got tired of it and decided to try to catch him in the act, and allegedly they did do that. Now, there's an interesting, I guess, aspect to the Orbeen Davis and the George Keating lynching. And that is that Orbeen Davis and George Keating were actually, they were not these drifters like the three guys that had been hanged in Rapid City. They were not just these cowboy horse thief types. They were somewhat prominent citizens. George Keating had been involved with charitable endeavors in Deadwood, Lee, Central City. He was the treasurer of a group that had promoted a charitable thing for raising money for homeless and poor in Deadwood. Keating was a prominent citizen. And here's the other thing, an interesting thing. Well, before I get there, I guess I'll show you this. Orbeen Davis is buried. You're not going to find many lynch victims who have a headstone. But he's buried in Rose Hill Cemetery in Spearfish. After he was lynched, his brother defended him to his own death. saying that he had been framed, that he really wasn't part of this whole deal. But Orbeen Davis had a family who took care of him and saw to his rights. More importantly, more interestingly, and I know you're not going to be able to read this, but I wanted to show it anyway. I got this from the State Historical Records in archives in Pierre. George Keating, who was lynched along with Orbeen Davis, may be the only lynching victim ever that had an estate that had to be probated. He left a surviving widow, Elizabeth Nellie Keating, and she probated his estate. They had a rather elaborate funeral, rosewood casket, wagons, and of course services as undertaker. It cost, what, $25 to be embalmed at that time. So all of these were parts of the court record in what's now Lawrence County. As I said, probably the only lynch victim to have an estate that had to be probated. A couple of days after their lynching, which was really quite a newsworthy event in the Deadwood area, this ad appeared in the Black Hills Daily Times, one of the Deadwood newspapers. A guy who ran a restaurant, Gandolfo's restaurant, thought he would be clever. Remember the rhapsodic thing I spoke about earlier, the reporting of the lynchings? I don't know if Gandolfo ever got any business from this particular ad, but I'm sure it was spoken of a lot. And this is actually from the paper. I wanted to make sure that it was readable as part of my PowerPoint, so I typed it up. But yeah, shuffle off the mortal coil. Nellie Keating, George's widow, was put on a suicide watch for like a week. She was described in the Deadwood paper as being demented with grief. A group of people put on a charitable ball at the Central City Opera House to raise money for her, and that was advertised, and it apparently was a huge social success and a huge financial failure, to the point where Nellie Keating had to take out an ad in the Deadwood Pioneer paper saying that she was not responsible for the debts of the persons who had organized the charitable endeavor. Poor woman. Now, she did end up marrying a guy named Wes Snyder, who had, again, it's not legible, I'm sorry, but Wes Snyder had provided the bond for her to be the executrix of the George Keating estate, and they later married. The rest of her life was not easy. She and Wes Snyder had 2 children, one of whom drowned in Whitewood Creek. Life was not easy for Nellie Keating, but it certainly wasn't easy after her husband was lynched. Interesting, the report of her marriage in the Deadwood paper referred to her only as Mrs. Keating. It was in April of 1880, a year and a half or so after the lynching, and the Deadwood paper reported that Mrs. Keating married Wes Snyder. So chronologically, the next lynching that happened is Lane Johnny, Southern Hills, down around Hermosa, in the fall of, shortly after Keating, sometime in the late fall of 1878. Actually, I guess it was a shooting, not a lynching. Lane Johnny had been captured as a horse thief by Boone May, a lawman, lawman, and they were transporting him to court. And Boone May later reported that Lame Johnny had tried to escape, so he had no choice but to shoot him. So it's not really a lynching, but I kind of include it because Boone May is such an interesting character. I wish I knew more about him, and there are some people who do. He was a kind of a precursor of the Clint Eastwood character Dirty Harry. Boone May shot several people who were trying to escape, and his real name was Daniel Boone May, but he was embarrassed about that, so he just wanted to be known as Boone May. And Boone was a conniving, almost clever, well, not almost, he was clever, person. He worked in Deadwood. He worked as a shotgun messenger, an individual who was hired to guard the stagecoaches that were transporting not only people but money and gold. And he hung out in Deadwood for a while, and he got to be friends with another interesting character who had at least 3 or 4 names. Belle Sidron, Madame Lurleen, and another that I can't think of. She was a rather flamboyant woman who lived in Deadwood for a few years, had a theatrical background and a theatrical talent, had a great deal of wealth, ran a gambling house in Deadwood, and Boone May kind of courted her and became involved with her, and perhaps they even had an affair. And Boone May knew what he was doing because she was also a lover of a couple of road agents or highwaymen or stagecoach thieves, Archie McLaughlin and Billy Mansfield. And Boone May obtained from this Belle Sidron, Madame Lurleen, information about where Archie and Billy were going to be having their next job. And he got them arrested, and they turned up hanged, not in Deadwood, as I told you, nobody ever got lynched in Deadwood, but they ended up hanged near Deadwood, also in 1878. Chronologically, the next one is Fly Speck Billy, February of 1881, down in Custer. That all happened all at once. Fly Speck Billy came into a saloon and ran into an acquaintance of his, and he wanted to play poker with him and have a drink, and wanted to buy him a drink, and the guy said, "No, I don't want a drink," and so Fly Speck Billy shot the guy, and he was immediately dragged out by a group of people and dispatched right then and there. That's kind of unusual. Usually they have to kind of track people down before they lynch them, but this was, they caught him on the spot. I don't spend a lot of time with Lame Johnny and with Fly Speck Billy because they don't really have at least to me, the interesting backstories that, for example, the George Keating and the Orbean Davis lynchings do. But the next one I want to talk about really does. And that was in Sturgis in 1883. You all know about Fiddler's Tree? I drove out there a couple hours ago to where I've been told Fiddler's Tree was, out on 5th Street near the railroad. Of course, there's no tree anymore that could have been Fiddler's Tree, but Fiddler, he was I guess I like to say that Fiddler was lynched more for his body of work rather than for any particular incident. Fiddler was just incorrigible. The rumor was that he had murdered a guy in Pierre, and that he had gotten off because his family had some money and they'd hired a really good lawyer and they'd also paid off a bunch of witnesses. And he came out here to the Black Hills and just got in trouble all the time. In January of 1883, he was indicted for grand larceny. Judgment was postponed. By November of 1883, it was reported in the Deadwood paper that Sturgis was having a lot of trouble. Among other things, the Bible in the schools had stirred up the infidel and Christian parties of the community, and they're going after each other in the public record. There's lawlessness in the population. Finally had to set up a vigilance committee. And there was a vigilance committee set up in Sturgis in this late fall, early winter of 1883. And this committee put out a bunch of placards that had the 3777 insignia, and notices were placed on several parties to, according to the paper, get up and get, or take the consequences. And one of them that was told to get up and get was Alex Fiddler. Fiddler said that he would get up and get when he was ready. And the Vigilantes said, well, we would assist you in getting ready. But I don't know if he actually left. I think he must have left, because the next thing we'd see about Fiddler is that in December of 1883, a month after he was told to get up and get from Sturgis, he was arrested in Deadwood for assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, and delivered from Sturgis to Deadwood. And the paper just reported Deputy Sheriff Suter came up from Sturgis Tuesday night with Alex Fiddler, a hard case. I don't know what happened to that particular charge, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, but obviously Fiddler didn't have to go to jail, because in June of 1884, Fiddler, a guy named Hughes, and another fellow from a soldier from Fort Meade, assaulted a man named Theodore Schramm. Theodore Schramm. He was referred to as an immigrant because he was from eastern South Dakota. The Deadwood paper said an immigrant, Theodore Schramm, had kind of let it be known in the Sturgis area that he had some money, and that was not a very wise thing to do. He displayed a roll of bills, and he had with him some mules that he wanted to sell to Fort Meade. The commanding officer at Fort Meade thought he recognized one of Theodore Schramm's mules as already belonging to the government. So things started to go south for him there, but they really went south within a day or two when our friend Alexander Fiddler and his buddy Hughes and another fellow whose name I can't remember pistol whipped him and took all his money. Well, a lot of people could have gotten away with beating up Theodore Schramm for this thing at that time, but Alex Fiddler was not the guy who could have gotten away with anything. People were tired of him. So Theodore Schramm reported his being the victim of that robbery and assault to the authorities, and they immediately arrested Hughes, the accomplice. Hughes confessed, and he implicated Alexander Fiddler. And so away we go. We've got to bring Alexander Fiddler to justice, and the authorities did arrest Alexander Fiddler, and they brought him in and put him in a structure in Sturgis, but it didn't last long. Meanwhile, Hughes got up to the Deadwood jail, but Fiddler was placed in a structure here in Sturgis where he was taken out, and well, he was lynched at Fiddler's tree. And the reports of that, by this time Sturgis had a paper, by the way, Weekly Tribune, I believe it was called, and they reported that it was an unusual suicide because he had been found hanging from the tree, and that they actually reported it as a suicide, tongue-in-cheek. You know, again, they're kind of being kind of being clever about this whole deal. And of course, nobody knows who did it, and nobody ever will know who did it. But he was hanged. Hughes, and by the way, they got away with like $350. And Fiddler had hidden his share behind a mirror in his apartment. And before they hanged him, he confessed that, as to where it was. And so the authorities went to his apartment, talked to his live-in girlfriend, got the rest of the money. She was never charged, although there was a suggestion that she could have been charged as an accomplice after the fact, or as an accessory, but she never was. But here's a thing that's always fascinated me about this Fiddler incident. Fiddler's been executed in June of 1884. Hughes, his accomplice, is still in jail in Deadwood, awaiting trial. In late July of 1884, Hughes's mother arrived in Deadwood at 4 a.m. and went to the jail, woke up the jailer, or the jailer was awake and she wanted to see her son, and he accommodated her because she was rather a stately lady. She said that her husband and another son had been killed at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and she just wanted to see her son. In less than a week, Theodore Schramm, remember? He's the immigrant from eastern South Dakota, the victim of the Fiddler Hughes crime. He disappeared. He wasn't available to testify against Hughes. Nobody could figure out where he went. Well, they finally caught up with him, and he had a bundle of cash again, which he shouldn't have had. Well, what happened was Mrs. Hughes paid him off. She gave him about $300 to run away and not testify against her son. You think if Fiddler just could have made it a couple more days. If they would have just taken him to Deadwood from jail, he would have also benefited from this bribery that Hughes's mother gave to Theodore Schramm. Well, they finally caught up with Theodore Schramm and brought him back, but I wasn't able to track down what happened. Obviously, he could have been incarcerated because he was, evaded process. He'd been served with a subpoena and he didn't show up because he'd been paid off. But I don't know whatever became of that case. And I don't know whatever became of Hughes. Maybe somebody does know. But perhaps he got off because the prosecuting witness didn't show up for trial. I don't know. The Sturgis Weekly Record reported particulars of a peculiar suicide. Alexander Fiddler had fallen off a tree. One of the more interesting stories. It's kind of, that's what fascinated me about these lynching stories. The backstory of George Keating, the backstory of the co-defendant Hughes, who, these things that were going on were amazing. Now, the next one that I talk about is the Stoneville gunfight. Valentine's Day of 1884. Some of you know about that and probably know more than I do. But Stoneville is a little town near Alzada, Montana. And the Axelby horse thief gang was there in Stoneville, and they were there supposedly on their way down to this country to rescue one of their members who had been arrested. They were going to break him out of jail. So the rumor was that here's the Axelby gang in Stoneville, hold up. This gunfight, and a couple of law enforcement officers from Lawrence County went to Stoneville to apprehend them. And there was a gunfight. And this gunfight would make a better movie than Gunfight at the OK Corral, trust me. Because it was like 20 below and blizzarding, and there's a shootout in front of the Stoneville Saloon. And one of the persons who was killed in the shootout was a law enforcement officer named John O'Hara. He is buried in the Rose Hill Cemetery in Sturgis, or in Spearfish. Coincidentally, not more than 200 feet from where lynching victim Orbean Davis is buried. And killed by horse thieves is on the John O'Hara tombstone in Rose Hill Cemetery. It's beautiful. That's a fairly recent photograph. I took it less than a year ago. So what happened about why this figures into my lynching story, my vigilante story, is there was a young fellow who was happened to be with the Axel B gang, and his name was Harry Tuttle. And Harry Tuttle was came from a wealthy family in the eastern part of the United States, I believe New York. And Harry Tuttle was an expert on horses, and he was a horse trader. He legitimately bought and sold horses. And somehow or the other, poor Harry Tuttle ended up with the Axelby gang on February 14 of 1884. And in the gunfight, Harry Tuttle was wounded. He got on a mule and tried to ride away, and the mule started bucking, and bullets were flying everywhere, and he took a bullet in his elbow. Very, very serious and disabling injury. And he was taken by law enforcement officers to what passed for a hospital in Spearfish in February of 1884. Now we kind of come full circle. Remember Uncle John? The guy who told this Deadwood paper that he was part of a vigilance committee and they were going to take care of horse thieves. Uncle John, well, it's not reported, but this is, I'm sure, what happened. Uncle John and his friend Bill Gay, I'll talk about him a little bit more detail here in a minute or two, given my time. Uncle John and his friend Bill Gay came into and about 6 other guys dressed in buffalo robes came into the hospital in Spearfish. And like 3 in the morning, and it's still 20 below outside, it's horrible. And they dragged Harry Tuttle out of his hospital bed, dragged him across the street, across the road to this location, which is now the Indian Springs Gazebo in Spearfish Park. Beautiful place, pretty much across from the Spearfish Park Pavilion. And they put a rope around his neck and tied one end of the rope to a tree, and threw him over the cliff. And again, his neck didn't break, he strangled. He was probably innocent of any horse thievery. And there was actually a $15,000 reward put out for anybody who would report the persons who had lynched Harry Tuttle. Nobody ever collected on it. I don't think Uncle John needed the money. Time-wise, I'm not in very good shape, am I? I'm running down. I mentioned Bill Gay briefly. Bill Gay there are 2 things about Bill Gay. He was a prominent citizen of the area in the Northern Hills. Gayville, now the extinct town. He founded Gayville. He owned several businesses in Spearfish. And he was a very good friend of Uncle John Cashin. They went buffalo hunting a lot together, and the guys who dragged Tuttle out of the hospital and threw him over the cliff were wearing buffalo coats, buffalo robes at the time they did it. John McClintock, in his book, Pioneer, Days in the Black Hills, says unequivocally that the plot to lynch Harry Tuttle was hatched in Bill Gay's saloon. Now, Bill Gay, He had committed murder at Gayville. There was a poor young man who became infatuated with Gay's wife, and Gay felt that he had no choice but to kill the young man. And he did. He killed him, and he was convicted of murder, and he was sent to the penitentiary in Detroit, Michigan. And he did some time there, a few months, and got officially pardoned and released, and he came back to Gayville, where the citizens had a brass band reception for him. He was popular. They didn't care that he killed somebody. Gay, though, ultimately, unlike anybody else, karma came back on Bill Gay. Karma came back and got him. He moved away from Gayville and Spearfish, went to Montana, where he and his brother started ranching and ran afoul of law enforcement authorities in Montana, and a sheriff came to the Gay ranch to arrest him, and there was a gunfight, and Gay shot and killed the sheriff, and was convicted of murder in Montana. And Gay, as I said, was convicted and sentenced to be hanged, and his hanging was scheduled. There's an invitation to his hanging. Gay's the fellow on the left. He's the fellow on the left there, and then he was going to be hanged at the same time with a guy named Biggerstaff on December 20 of 1895. But the hanging got postponed because he had an appeal in the Montana Supreme Court. And he was reported in the Deadwood paper as after his hanging got postponed, and he said, "Well, I ain't worried none, because lots of men have been sentenced to be hanged, and none of them ever got hanged, and I ain't worried." Well, turns out that he did actually get hanged later on in the spring of 1896, and according to the Deadwood paper, was dragged kicking, sobbing, and screaming to the gallows. It's a really lurid story, the whole thing about Gay. The Montana Supreme Court issued a lengthy opinion that talked about a lot of issues that came up during the trial, one of which involved incest between Gay and his daughter, alleged incest, I should say, even though everybody's dead. And interestingly enough, when he was successfully hanged the second time, the only family member who showed up to protest was the daughter who supported him. That is how I think we can state with a lot of certainty that Cashner and Gay were the Vigilance Committee that hanged George Keating, Orbean Davis, and Harry Tuttle in Spearfish. In the Bob Lee book that was written in the early 1960s, I believe it's called Shortgrass Prairie, something, I don't remember the name exactly. He talks about the Keating lynching, and he says this was definitely a who's who of Spearfish area ranchers, including our buddy Uncle John and Bill Gay. Since we're here in Sturgis, there is the other lynching that has to be mentioned. Isn't that an unfortunate name? But he's not the lynching victim, he was the murder victim. Dr. Horatio Lynch, a soldier at Fort Meade, Corporal Howland. To the best of my knowledge, the only black person ever to be lynched in the Black Hills. Also, one of the very few black people who were not lynched for racial reasons. He kind of happened to be black. Corporal Howland had a girlfriend. Her name was Meade. He beat her regularly. After one beating, she was injured so severely, she went to see Dr. Horatio Lynch, who was a very, very popular and highly respected individual in Sturgis. And she told him how she had gotten her injuries, and he told her that she needed to report her injuries and how she got them at the hands of Corporal Hallen, her boyfriend. She needed to report them to the sheriff, and she did so. And Corporal Hallen reacted violently. This is one of the more premeditated murders that you might read about in the Black Hills. I mean, he orchestrated a disguise, he changed uniforms with another soldier. He even he had a pet dog that he somehow got implicated in the thing to make it look like it wasn't him. He set this whole thing up, and then he went down to Lynch's office and shot and killed him late one night. And he was taken in almost immediately, and he didn't last long. And he was taken to Fiddler's Tree. And he was the second person to be lynched from Fiddler's Tree. Yet, he's buried in the National Cemetery at Fort Meade. Can't read it very well, but it's Corporal Ross Hallen. Doesn't say anything about how he died. And coincidentally, so is Dr. Lynch, buried in the cemetery. Initially, he was not buried there, but he was later moved to the National Cemetery in Fort Meade, and that is a plaque that is near there. Some of you have probably seen this plaque. That kind of gives a synopsis of the story. There are some other legends now and then that you hear about lynchings in the hills. Most of them, if not all of them, are not true. There was a story reported in True West magazine, which is actually, it's a pretty good magazine. A lot of the stories are accurate. But there's a story that was published in True West in the 1950s about someone who was hanged twice in Deadwood and survived. That didn't happen. I never could find any indication of that. There was a report in 1878 about an alleged bigamist named S.F. Wood, who had been twice hanged and given up for dead. He had a great lawyer named Tom Harvey, who, according to the paper, as usual, acquitted his man. And with the marks of the rope and the report of his death, attorney Tom Harvey remarked that it was the first time he had ever been called upon to defend a corpse. Tom is a bulldozer and believes in giving a man a chance, dead or alive. That's pretty much the factual account of the as best I know, a quick summary of the lynchings that occurred in the Black Hills. The first legal hanging was in December of 1882. The Deadwood paper, I don't want to take any more of your time, but the Deadwood paper came out with an editorial that was very critical of capital punishment. In a very sarcastic way, it said, well, we have finally achieved the pinnacle of civilization. We have hanged a man on the streets of Deadwood. Deadwood paper was never particularly proud of executions, legal or illegal, even though their first account of a lynching had that rhapsodic thing that I had talked about in the initial article about the lynching of Dick Burnett in the Southern Hills. So that's it. I think I've gone over time, and I apologize for that, but if any of you want to talk to me afterwards, I'll be here. Thank you.